Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire's Business of America podcast with your host, Jerry Rogers.
Welcome to another edition of the Business of America podcast. I'm your host, Jerry Rogers, as if you were expecting someone else. We are in for a special treat today. One of the biggest, best minds in the public arena today. Remember, our program is based on Teddy Roosevelt's Man in the Arena. We examine the issues around the men and women in the arena, making things happen, whether it's in business or science or in advocacy. They come here to the Business of America. And today, I'm pleased to introduce, and we'll ask him about himself as well. Himself, my grandmother would say, oh, himself will tell us about himself, my Irish grandmother. But Dr. George Tidmarsh, MD, PhD, entrepreneur, former CEO, La Jolla Pharma, Stanford University, author of Science Reviews and Studies. He's a reformer. He's someone who the very brightest and the best come to for ideas and for change. And so, Dr. Tidmarsh, George, welcome to the Business of America.
Thank you, Jerry. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for that very eloquent and lofty introduction. So I greatly appreciate that, Jerry. I'm happy to be here with you.
Well, you know, it's interesting. You and I have talked often on the WhatsApp and other exchanges of ideas early on in the Trump administration, talking about the NIH and Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. Now I know that you are working with and doing science reviews for Dr. Marty Makary at FDA. In fact, we saw each other just a couple of weeks ago. You had a very good study in the Journal of the Academy of Public Health. We've talked about this before. We had its founders on, the founding editor on the program, the Journal of the Academy of Public Health. And you have a piece I keep on saying, pardon me, I'm an editor, so I think of things as pieces and commentary. This is a piece of science review. This is a paper so esteemed that Marty Makary, Dr. Makary at FDA, he led off what's going to be a series now, a regular event of scientific reviews. But you did a review, the safety of our foods and drugs, a reevaluation by FDA of talc. Now, you say talc, and people are like, oh boy, let's go to Joe Rogan. Let's go to another podcast. But trust me, stay here, because what we're going to talk about is science, the new science, getting politics out of science and putting science back into science. I think your paper does lots of things. The FDA event that you were an anchor on the panel, I think it puts science back on the map. It begins to reset the public discussion around our public health agencies, all of whom took a blow to the head during COVID. So, George, tell us about your work with Dr. Bhattacharya, with Dr. Marty Makary, the paper, and talk about food safety science and where we're heading.
Thank you for asking about my work with Talc, because I believe that the review, a thorough review, systematic review of what we put in our bodies is essential. And I think it's long overdue. And I commend this administration, Secretary Kennedy and Dr. Makary, Commissioner Makary, for elevating the discussion on this critical public health issue. Why have we not examined the safety of additives to our food supply and other components of our nutrition that we put into our bodies and our children's bodies? And I believe it's long overdue. What's amazing about this is that I'm trained as a physician, a neonatologist, pediatrician, and none of my training over decades really focused on toxic additives to nutrition, to food supply, to infant formulas, to all sorts of everyday foods that we put into our body. And it really is a credit to Secretary Kennedy and Commissioner McCary for elevating the discussion on this. So when I first met Dr. McCary and in last fall, which I met him at Stanford when Jay Bhattacharya and I hosted a pandemic preparedness conference, and Dr. McCary attended, I was struck by his passion to protect public health, American public health, by examining the safety of our food supply. So although public health is not my training, obviously being a pediatrician and physician, public health is a major part of what my responsibility is. So with the motivation that Dr. McCary and Secretary Kennedy provided, I turned my attention to looking at the safety of food additives. In particular, I started a systemic review of a list of compounds, chemicals that FDA back in the 70s determined was, quote unquote, generally regarded as safe, or GRAS. So in the 70s, the FDA undertook a systematic evaluation using panels of experts to determine if certain chemicals that were already in our food supply, or those that food manufacturers wanted to add to our food supply, could be determined to be safe. And they did so. However, after making those determinations in the 70s and early 80s, no one re-examined the safety of that list of GRAS, or generally regarded as safe substances. And you can imagine from the early 80s until now, how data and experience has evolved. And unfortunately, until this administration brought it to our attention that, gee, maybe there's new data, we ought to reevaluate the safety of these additives, did we begin to evaluate. So I undertook a very thorough and systematic review. There will be more to come, but I think the most obvious and so-called low-hanging fruit in this was talc. And the revelation for me was that talc is added to our food supply. So I think we all know that talc is on the radar screen as a useful but toxic cosmetic, or also in baby powder. So is used by many generations of caregivers, mothers, fathers, taking care of their babies, and also on their own bodies, to typically in the genital area, to keep the genital area dry and hygienic. However, it turns out that talc is carcinogenic. And this came into the news most recently over the last decades or so, and culminated most recently with a proposed settlement by J&J, the manufacturer of baby powder. And that was forced by numerous judgments in the courts that gave significant financial settlement to women that had developed ovarian cancer that was thought to be due to talc. So the revelation for me, as I published this piece in the Journal of the Academy of Public Health, was that talc is added to our food supply. That it literally took me weeks to realize this, and I kept knocking myself on the head and saying, "Wow, why are we adding talc to our food and drug supply?" And the reality is, it's an antiquated additive that played a role at a certain time, but is outdated. It's been in much of our pharmaceuticals, it's been replaced with a modern, safer, inexpensive alternative. In fact, there's several different alternatives. But when you go back, many of the legacy pharmaceutical drugs like Lipitor, Synthroid, Nexium use talc in the manufacturing process. The updated version, something called magnesium stearate, which plays the same role as talc, is now used in the more modern manufacture. However, those legacy drugs never went back and replaced talc with a safer magnesium stearate. In addition, food manufacturers use talc for many of the same reasons. So talc is what's called a lubricant or a bulking agent. So it's used as a lubricant in pharmaceuticals and other types of manufacturing to make sure that the powder that's put into the machines as it's processed flows properly. So that's lubricant. It lubricates the path of these powders in the machines for pharmaceuticals to press the pill, make sure the pill doesn't stick to the tooling, make sure that it doesn't stick to the various tubes and vats that are used in both food and drug manufacturing. So it did play a role. We didn't know at the time. There's no villain. No one, I think, purposely put it in the food and drugs to, poison us. It was done with good intent, but we now have updated data, and we need to replace it.
This is an important idea that in science, there's progression, things change, new developments. We hear, unfortunately, there's a consensus, or most scientists agree. The science is over. The discussion is over. I mean, infamously, on Meet the Press, there was a statement once by the host who said, on a different scientific issue, on climate change, he would no longer have on contrarians because the science is settled. And I thought, regardless of your position on climate change and CO2 and emissions and man-made pollution, you don't want to stifle debate. And again, what I find very refreshing, and I've been involved in healthcare policy for 2 decades, is how Dr. McCary, how the Trump administration, HHS Secretary Kennedy, Jay Bhattacharya at NIH, they're willing to take the risk of talking about science and how science with new information changes. Let me ask you this, because I love that you said also no villain here, because very often in our politics, there has to be a villain. Someone has to be the boogeyman. Someone has to be the bad guy. And today, both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, love to put big pharma. They're the villain. They're the ones who are hurting us. But in this case, pharma is moving in the right direction. But let me ask you this: is there any pushback? What about the cost of medicines that make this a change? For that matter, the cost of food that will start changing how they put those products on the shelves. Is there pushback, or do you think there's some kind of we can get going here and make changes?
The only pushback I've seen, and I've talked to a lot of people, scientists, consumers, friends, family. The only pushback I've seen was a Wall Street Journal editorial board piece, which was unsourced. They didn't reference anything. And to me was just clearly a blatant political piece that seems to want to give no credit where credit's due, and perhaps is at the behest of, say, J&J because of their pending settlement. I don't know that. I don't want to accuse them of that, but I don't understand why anyone would oppose this, because I'm not suggesting anybody added talc to food and drugs maliciously, knowing that it was bad for us. It's an antiquated remnant of a different time. And as you stated, science is by definition an evolution of knowledge. And to me, there is no such thing as settled science. That is an oxymoron phrase. And let me give you an example. You might say to yourself, well, gee, isn't gravity settled? Don't we know about everything there is to know about gravity, and there's nothing new to learn? There's nothing new to debate about it? That is completely wrong, okay? We now know 2 things. First of all, that in the earliest generation of the universe, gravity was repulsive, not attractive. Okay, that's amazing. All right, that recently came into view within the field of physics and the understanding of that. The earliest, nanoseconds to microseconds of the generation of the universe. In addition, physicists still debate what mediates gravity. What is there, a graviton particle? So something as simple that you would think is settled as gravity is not settled. There's no such thing in science. It has to constantly evolve. Let me give you another example. When I was trained as a pediatrician, I was told that parents should avoid giving their children peanuts or any type of other allergens during the first year of life. You know what we did with that knowledge? We created a generation of individuals who are now highly allergic to peanuts. We now know the best thing to do is to expose young children, infants in their first year of life, to small doses of allergens. And in fact, that makes them tolerant. So we evolved. Imagine if we said, oh, it's settled that you shouldn't expose a young child to peanuts. We would continue to generate highly allergic individuals. So this is really just an extension of that principle of constantly wanting to re-examine any kind of dogma, any kind of theory, any kind of practice that we call science, and update it with new information. So, for example, those in the 70s and early 80s that were convened by FDA to determine if these substances were safe, acted in good faith. They used the knowledge they had at the time. They determined that it was safe. Does that mean they should not continuously update that? That's the mistake here, is we didn't continuously re-examine. We now know, after decades of new information and debate, that in fact, talc is carcinogenic. I would say it's probably carcinogenic. And the reason I just modify that slightly is that is the conclusion of the World Health Organization International Agency on the Research of Cancer. So this is a highly august body that convened 29 experts across the world, debated for months and months and months, and published last July their conclusion that talc is probably carcinogenic. And in fact, that led the European Union to ban talc in cosmetics by the year 2027. So that's updated information. These 29 experts looked at everything we have, the epidemiology of ovarian cancer with women using talc, the animal studies that were conducted to evaluate the toxicity of talc. All this new information came after the 70s, when talc was determined to be so-called GRAS, generally regarded as safe. So it's incumbent on us as a society, and certainly those that consider themselves scientists, to question their conclusions, question their practices, incorporate new information. And as you said, I applaud this administration for doing that. And I know Dr. Bhattacharya, Dr. McCary, Senator Kennedy are highly, highly motivated and focused on good science and updating our science. And those that resist that are the ones you have to worry about.
It's interesting. I'm thinking, I have a two-part question, because obviously talc is used, but also we're having a renewed debate over our nutrition. We were told for years, have less protein, more carbohydrates, right? And now we know that food pyramid is wrong. We now know better about nutrition, but yet, because of Make America Healthy Again, because of politics, it seems to me that Secretary Kennedy is putting forward an agenda to make things better, to question what we've done in the past, to bring in new ideas. And because he's RFK Jr., he works for Donald Trump, it's almost like, well, we didn't create it. We didn't think of it. So therefore, it's those guys and those guys are bad. And what disturbs me is after COVID, you would think that our political leaders, but also our scientific leaders, would be less hysterical, and more focused on common ground. One of the few areas in policy today, I think criminal justice reform, I think a lot of big tech issues, and certainly healthcare policy, science policy. There really is, when you close the door, a lot of agreement, a lot of both left and right agree, but yet we get into the public realm, we get into the clickbait and the podcasting and the radio shows and the cable channels, and we just want to yell at each other. Again, talk about how Dr. McCary, Dr. Bhattacharya, Secretary Kennedy, how they're trying to, again, this is a paradigm shift in terms of how we talk about and deal in the business of science. Number one, number two, and I'm an Irish guy, so I'm very wordy. What is the impact, the cost impact of looking at examining these issues to patients, i.e., their medicines, etc., but also to consumers? I'm a family of 7. We have 5 kids. The grocery bill of late has been higher than our mortgage. So
Yeah.
so talk about how we're taking science discussion in a new direction and how that might impact what we pay for medicines and what we pay for food.
Well, I think there's 2 parts to that answer. One is, the concrete, what does it cost to, let's say, replace talc in medicines? But I think the, perhaps larger, more important answer to that question is, what is the cost, the societal cost to this chronic disease epidemic we're suffering, and the toxicity of some of the things in our food and drug supply? So the first part of that answer is that, in fact, it may be, certainly with talc, less expensive to replace talc with modern alternatives like magnesium stearate. So take, for example, 3 of the top 10 prescribed medications: Lipitor, a statin that lowers cholesterol; Synthroid, that's a replacement for those with low thyroid activity; and Nexium, a pill designed to decrease stomach acid for those with reflux, so-called GERD. Those 3 drugs, the branded names, came out decades ago, and they contain talc. They are off patent, and so there are generic alternatives that in fact do not contain talc, because the modern pharmaceutical manufacturing process replace in essentially all drugs, all solid oral dosage formulations replaced talc with magnesium stearate. So each of those 3 drugs I mentioned have generic alternatives that are less expensive and do not contain talc. So in one sense, you can actually replace this toxic substance with a less expensive alternative. I would bet that's also true for our food supply. Although I'm not an expert in food manufacturing, magnesium stearate has the same properties as talc. It's this lubricant, and it's very inexpensive and widely available. So, for example, talc is used in candy and gum. In gum, it's used in the gum base itself. So that's the base of the chewy thing that stays in your mouth even after the taste is gone. Talc is in there. It's also used to make sure that the gum and candy do not stick to the wrapper. So the simple everyday thing is open up a stick of gum. That white powder is likely to be talc. They could just replace that with magnesium stearate. And again, the cost of that is de minimis. So the impact to you and your family, your 5 children and your spouse, would be minimal. There's a certain transition cost, but it seems to me that that's very, very trivial in the grand scheme of things, certainly for pharmaceutical manufacturing. And in fact, one of my recommendations to FDA during the meeting and in writing as we're preparing this is that the FDA should alert pharmacies and pharmacists that there is talc in these branded drugs, and in fact they should dispense and interchange to the cheaper generic drugs that do not contain talc. So the second part of that answer is the chronic disease epidemic that we're suffering. It's very possible that some of these additives have triggered the explosion in some of the problems we're facing, such as chronic disease, irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. We're ingesting talc. Talc is a very pro-inflammatory agent. In fact, in medicine, we use talc for its ability to cause massive inflammation and then fibrosis. We use it to in specialized cases to cause a scarring that walls off in a problem such as fluid accumulation near the lung. So it's extremely possible, we don't know this for sure, but it's very possible that ingestion of large amounts of talc or chronically small amounts of talc can cause inflammation in the gut. We're spending billions and billions of dollars on these chronic diseases. So why not prevent it? So my second answer to your question is, we may save billions of dollars and improve the quality of life by eliminating some of these substances from our food and drug supply.
I know that you had a big part in Real Clear's launch of its science journal, the Journal of the Academy of Public Health. Talk about why it's different, why it's necessary. Again, I think you're taking a leadership role in the paradigm shift of how we talk about science, engage in science. My hope, George, and I mean this very sincerely, is that physicians and men who and women who understand science will do more of what you're doing in terms of resetting the debate. Because again, I understand the importance of the World Health Organization, of the NIH, of the CDC, of all of these health agencies, but the American people don't trust these agencies any longer. I think the Journal of the Academy of Public Health is trying to bring integrity back to science, and I think that's a great thing. But talk about the journal, and again, talk about how I'm an optimist, a despairing optimist. My hope is that that we will move science and these health agencies back to a place where they are the gold standard, where the American people do trust the science. But talk about the journal and talk about how we need to trust science.
You're hitting on a major important topic, Jerry, and I think that there were problems hidden all along that became evident, and in fact, I think became worse during the pandemic and the politicization of science. And with regard to scientific publication in journals, what became clear is that the editors in chief and the editors in general of major scientific journals exercised political interdiction to ensure that a certain narrative, a political narrative, was maintained. And that is absolutely antithetical to the scientific process. And we know that now. I mean, it's not even debatable that there was politicization at the level of these scientific journals, and in particular the editors. And if you look at what the process is, if I'm a scientist, I want to publish something, I want to publish it in an appropriate and highest level journal I can, I send it into the editor. The editor, that editor in chief has essentially unilateral monarchy control of what goes into the journal, because as it goes into their inbox, they can say, nope, I don't want this. They can also say, I'll send it out to a reviewer, and they choose the reviewers. And that is all done in silence. The public never knows about it. The submitting scientist doesn't know about it. The Journal of the Academy of Public Health, the RCP, Journal of the Academy of Public Health, changes that paradigm. And we have very little editorial control. The gatekeeping comes at the level of the academy itself. So there's a selective process to ensure that qualified scientists are accepted into the academy. And these are scientists that are trained and well published in some field of public health, which is actually quite broad. Once accepted into the academy, And the acceptance is determined by a very august board of directors. But once there's Academy acceptance, then those members can publish in the journal without editorial control. And the second major advance of this journal is, instead of the evaluation and review of the publication done silently, it is done actually in public. So the reviews are published contemporaneously with, in fact, the published paper. So we have a paradigm shift, and we hope to eliminate the politicization of science that was unveiled and, in fact, made much worse during COVID.
Our guest, George Tidmarsh, thank you for joining the Business of America. I appreciate your insights. And also, I'm still optimistic, I think, maybe despairing optimism, but that we are moving in the right direction in science, in our healthcare, in our food. And again, this is good news for American patients, for American consumers. And thank you for joining us. Thank you to our audience. Go to the Federal Newswire. Go to where podcasts are posted, like the Business of America, where we're bringing in the doers in our economy, the doers in our science and advocacy, the men and women who make America work. These are the Business of America. Isn't just business, right? The cliche, the quote. The Business of America are the men and women, the entrepreneurs, the small businesses, the scientists, the advocates, the volunteers, those who set upon making America the exceptional culture that we are. So we'll see you next week, right here on the Business of America. Thanks.
This has been the Federal Newswire's Business of America podcast, hosted by Jerry Rogers. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream